The world, for 5 men, had shrunk to the inside of a steel box. Outside, it was Normandy, July 1944. A labyrinth of hedgerows and hidden fields the locals called the bocage. Inside their Sherman tank, it was a hot, cramped purgatory. For 6 hours, they had been sealed in, breathing a toxic cocktail of diesel fumes, stale sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of spent cordite that clung to the back of the throat. They were not men, not anymore. They were components of a war machine, a driver, a gunner, a loader, a co-driver, a commander. Ghosts in a 30-ton steel shell, then silence. The earth-shaking roar of their own engine died to a rumble, then a whisper. The terrifying scream of incoming German shells, the dreaded 88 seconds, was gone. The relentless chatter of machine gun fire that had hammered against their hull like angry hail ceased. The silence was so complete, it was deafening. It was a silence that felt both like a blessing and a terrible omen. In the claustrophobic confines of the tank, muscles unknotted, jaws unclenched. For the first time in hours, they could hear their own ragged breathing. From the commander's perch came the 5 words every man had been praying for, a phrase more welcome than any order to advance or fire. "Right, lads, let's brew up." It was a magical incantation. The words transformed the interior of the tank from a weapon of war into a temporary sanctuary. The spell was cast, and the ritual began. The driver, his face slick with grease and grime, scrambled out of his hatch, blinking in the sudden, hazy sunlight. He moved with a practiced grace, pulling a small, battered Primus stove from a stowage box. The wireless operator, his ears still ringing from the static and battle reports, began carefully gathering the tin mugs, their handles worn smooth by countless nervous hands. Another crewman produced the sacred tins of condensed milk and sugar, the treasures of their campaign. On the hot, flat deck of the engine compartment, their little ceremony unfolded. It was a ritual as sacredly British as the Union Jack stenciled on their turret. For 10 precious minutes, they were not soldiers, they were just men. They were Bill, from Liverpool, whose hands shook slightly as he worked the stove. They were Arthur, from Kent, who was trying to scrub the smell of cordite from under his fingernails. They were humans again, connected not by the grim mechanics of combat, but by the simple, civilized act of making tea. Steam began to rise from the blackened billy can as the water trembled on the verge of boiling, a small cloud of vapor in the vast, dangerous landscape of Normandy. It was a fragile signal of life, a tiny beacon of home in the middle of hell. They never saw the predator watching from the shadows. Less than 300 yards away, nestled perfectly within the dense green wall of a hedgerow, the sleek, sloped armor of a German Panther tank lay in wait. Its long 75mm cannon was already trained on them. The German crew had been patient. They had watched the Sherman rumble to a halt. They had seen the hatch open. They had observed the casual, almost arrogant assembly of men on the engine deck. They were waiting for this exact moment. The first armor-piercing round crossed the distance in less than a second. It didn't explode. It simply arrived with a sound like the crack of God's own whip, punching through the Sherman's thin side armor as if it were cardboard. Before the steam from the kettle could even dissipate, the world erupted. The second round, high explosive, slammed into the fuel tanks. 30 tons of American steel became an instantaneous funeral pyre. Of the 5 men who had been dreaming of a taste of home, 3 were vaporized. The 2 who managed to scramble from the inferno were unrecognizable, their bodies consumed by flames, with burns covering over 60% of their skin. They would die screaming in a field hospital hours later. The official war diary of their regiment, the 2nd Fife and Forfar Yeomanry, recorded the incident with the cold, brutal economy of military reporting. 1 tank, 5 casualties. Crew dismounted for tea. This was not a tragic, isolated mistake. This was a pattern, a bizarre, suicidal tradition that plagued the British Armoured Corps from the deserts of North Africa to the fields of France. Throughout the war, British tank crews would consistently halt their vehicles in moments of quiet, expose themselves to enemy fire, and present German anti-tank gunners with the most perfect of targets. Stationary, vulnerable, and completely distracted. The ritual became so predictable that German gunners were specifically trained to exploit it. Their manuals instructed them to hold their fire, to wait for the telltale signs of the British tea ceremony before engaging. A motionless British tank with its crew visible on the deck became a specific tactical designation in the German military lexicon. A Brewhenziel. A brewer's target. The mathematics were horrifying. An internal analysis by the Royal Armoured Corps revealed that crews brewing up externally spent an average of 12 minutes completely exposed. During those 12 minutes, situational awareness plummeted to almost zero. Men who were trained to scan the horizon for threats were now focused on a kettle. Their reaction time to an attack increased from a mere 4 seconds when sealed inside their tank to over 30 seconds when dismounted. In the brutal calculus of armoured warfare, that 26-second difference wasn't just a delay, it was a death sentence. Yet, asking a British soldier to abandon his tea was like asking him to fight without his rifle. It was unthinkable. So the question that haunted British High Command wasn't if their men would stop to make tea. They knew they wouldn't. The real question, the one that meant life or death for thousands, was far more complex. How do you let your soldiers have their cup of tea without them dying for it? The answer would lead to a secret invention, a piece of technology considered absurd by every other army in the world, yet one that would fundamentally change the rules of tank warfare forever. And it all started with understanding why a man would risk being burned alive for nothing more than a warm drink. To an outsider, especially to the pragmatic, coffee-fueled American mind, the behavior was madness, pure, unadulterated insanity. Why would battle-hardened men, veterans of some of the most brutal fighting in modern history, risk immediate, violent death for something as trivial as a cup of tea? The answer doesn't lie in military strategy, manuals, or equipment specifications. It lies in the very soul of the British soldier. It lies in a history forged in the mud and blood of a previous world war. To understand, you have to go back 30 years, to the nightmarish trenches of the First World War. In 1914, the British Army stumbled upon a discovery that would fundamentally reshape its understanding of human psychology under fire. They found that hot tea, delivered to men shivering in the front-line trenches, had a measurable, almost miraculous effect. Medical officers began to notice a pattern. The units that received regular tea rations suffered significantly fewer cases of what was then called shell shock. The data was so compelling that the War Office conducted formal studies. The conclusion was staggering. Regular access to hot tea could reduce stress-induced combat breakdowns by nearly 40%. The science behind this wasn't mystical. It was simple biochemistry. Tea contains L-theanine, an amino acid known to promote the generation of alpha waves in the brain. These are the same brain waves associated with a state of calm, focused alertness meditation without drowsiness. Combined with a modest dose of caffeine, it was the perfect chemical cocktail for a soldier. It reduced the paralyzing anxiety of imminent death while sharpening the focus needed to survive it. But the true power of tea went far beyond biochemistry. It was the ritual. In a world of industrialized slaughter, where men were reduced to numbers and fed into the meat grinder of artillery and machine guns, the act of making tea was a profound, silent rebellion. It was an act of reclaiming one's own humanity. The simple, methodical steps, boiling the water, warming the pot, letting the leaves steep, were small, familiar islands of domestic normality in a churning ocean of chaos and death. For the 3 minutes it took to brew and drink, a soldier holding a warm mug was not just a cog in a war machine, he was a man. He was, for a fleeting moment, back home in his own kitchen. He was civilized. He was sane. By the time the Second World War erupted, tea was no longer just a beverage. It was classified by the War Office as an essential supply, as critical as ammunition or bandages. When British forces were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk in 1940, in one of the most desperate retreats in military history, soldiers abandoned everything: artillery, vehicles, personal belongings, but eyewitness accounts from the ships that rescued them tell a remarkable story. Men who had left their rifles in the sand had somehow managed to bring their personal tea kettles, The most common question asked by these exhausted, traumatized survivors wasn't about food or medical aid. It was, when's tea? This cultural necessity had a powerful champion in one of the war's most famous figures, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. After taking command of the 8th Army in the North African desert in 1942, one of his very first orders was about the supply of tea. He decreed that every forward unit must maintain a 3-day reserve of tea, sugar, and milk, a stockpile that often exceeded their reserves of certain types of ammunition. When his baffled logistics officers protested, arguing that shells and bullets were more important than tea leaves, Montgomery's response was blunt and absolute. I can order men to fight without artillery support if necessary. I cannot order them to fight without tea. They simply won't do it properly. He wasn't exaggerating. In December 1942, during the frantic pursuit of Rommel's forces after the victory at El Alamein, the famed 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, outran their supply lines. After 3 days, the tea ran out. The effects were immediate and catastrophic. Commanders reported a sharp decline in morale, a spike in disciplinary problems, and a dangerous drop in alertness. Men grew irritable and sullen. They became less responsive to orders and started taking foolish, unnecessary risks. One squadron leader wrote in his diary a line that perfectly captures the sentiment. The lads would charge a German position for a packet of Players' cigarettes, but without army slang for tea, they'll barely clean their weapons properly. American observers attached to British units found this obsession utterly incomprehensible. General George S. Patton, a man who personified the aggressive, no-frills American approach to war, famously remarked that British troops would rather have tea than ammunition. He meant it as a scathing criticism, as a sign of softness. But to British commanders, it was a badge of honor. It was proof that their men weren't automatons who fought out of fear or blind obedience. They were human beings who fought for king, country, and the right to a proper brew. Everything else was negotiable. This deep, cultural and psychological need created a terrible paradox. The very thing that gave British soldiers the mental fortitude to fight was also getting them killed in staggering numbers. The ritual that provided a moment of sanity was, in practice, a form of tactical suicide. The High Command in London was faced with an impossible equation. On one side of the ledger were the cold, hard numbers. Tanks destroyed, men killed, battles potentially lost, all because of a kettle. On the other side was the fragile, intangible, yet absolutely essential soul of their army. Taking away tea wasn't an option. It would cripple morale more effectively than any German panzer division. But allowing the deadly ritual to continue was tantamount to murder. The problem seemed unsolvable. They couldn't take the tea away from the soldier, but they couldn't keep sacrificing soldiers for the tea. The solution, if one even existed, would not come from the top-down directives of generals in distant offices. It would have to come from the bottom up, from the mud, the grease, and the first-hand experience of the men who were actually facing the choice between their sanity and their survival. For the men in the War Office in London, the problem was a maddening ledger of loss. On one side, the cold, hard arithmetic of war. Dozens, then hundreds of highly trained tank crews killed. Millions of pounds worth of precious armoured vehicles turned into smouldering scrap metal. Entire offensive operations jeopardized. It was institutional suicide, a wound inflicted not by the enemy, but by themselves. The reports from the front lines were filled with the same grimly repetitive story. Got while brewing up. On the other side of the ledger was an item that couldn't be quantified, the morale of the British Army. Generals and staff officers, men who had been raised in the rigid traditions of the military, understood that an army's spirit was its center of gravity. Break that, and no amount of tanks or bullets could win a war. And they knew, with an instinctual certainty, that taking away the soldiers' tea would be a fatal blow to that spirit. It was the ultimate catch-22 of the war. To save their men, they had to let them continue a practice that was killing them. The situation festered. Memos were written, committees were formed. But the men behind the polished mahogany desks in Whitehall were disconnected from the greasy, terrifying reality of a tank turret. To them, It was an abstract problem of logistics and discipline. Their proposed solutions were predictable and useless. Stricter orders were issued against unauthorized stops. Punishments were threatened. But you cannot discipline a man for seeking a moment of sanity. You cannot order a human being to simply stop being human. So when a new, radical idea finally did emerge, it's no surprise it didn't come from a general. It came from the quiet of a hospital bed. The answer wasn't born in a high-tech lab or a military design bureau. It was sketched onto the back of a medical chart in a Southampton hospital by a 8-year-old electrical fitter named Peter Garlick. Garlick had been a tank radio operator in North Africa. In early 1943, his Grant tank took a direct hit near Tobruk. He'd survived the blast, but not unscathed. Lying in his recovery bed, his left hand was a mass of thick, white bandages. But here is the brutal irony that would change everything. His burns hadn't come from the exploding German shell. They came from the frantic moment before the hit. As the crew scrambled to get back inside their tank, someone had knocked over their Primus stove. A geyser of scalding hot tea had erupted over Garlick's hand. He was a casualty of the very ritual meant to bring comfort. Lying there for weeks, the sheer, maddening absurdity of it all consumed him. Men were dying because they had to get outside to do something as simple as boil water. His own injury was a direct result of that same, clumsy, dangerous process. But unlike the generals, Garlick wasn't thinking about discipline or tradition. As an electrical fitter, he thought about systems. His mind kept returning to a simple, powerful question. Why are we using fire when we're sitting inside a giant generator? Every tank had a powerful 24-volt electrical system to run its radio, its turret traverse, and its lights. It had an engine that was constantly recharging batteries. Why, he wondered, couldn't they just tap into that existing power to heat water? No flames, no smoke to give away their position, no getting out of the tank, no one having to choose between a moment of peace and a sniper's bullet. Just a switch, a heating element, and a safe, hot cup of tea. With his good hand, he began to draw. Not complex engineering blueprints, but simple, logical sketches. A container, a heating element scavenged from an existing piece of equipment, a wire running to the tank's main junction box. He submitted his hand-drawn proposal to the Ministry of Supply in March 1943, a simple idea from a simple soldier. The initial response from the military establishment was exactly what you'd expect. Scorn, disdain. One senior officer at the War Office scribbled a note on Garlick's proposal that perfectly captured the bureaucratic mindset. Waste of resources. Tanks are for fighting, not catering. Another added a single dismissive word, mollycoddling. What was next? Armoured bathrooms? The proposal was destined to die right there, buried under a mountain of paperwork by men who couldn't see past their own regulations. It would have, if not for one crucial piece of luck. The file landed on the desk of a man who understood. Major Anthony Norman was a tank veteran himself. He wasn't a faceless bureaucrat. He was an officer who had seen the inside of a tank in combat. More importantly, he had lost half his own crew during a brewing stop in the Libyan desert a year earlier. He had seen the names of men he knew personally on casualty reports filed under the heading Non-Combat Incident. When he read Peter Garlick's simple proposal, he didn't see a waste of resources. He saw a solution. He saw a way to stop writing letters to the mothers of dead soldiers. Norman recognized the simple genius in the idea immediately. It wasn't mollycoddling. It was tactical common sense. It was a force multiplier. An army that could stay alert and concealed was a more effective army. An army whose men felt cared for was an army that would fight harder. Major Norman refused to let the idea die. He fought for it. He bypassed the usual chain of command, using his own reputation and connections to push the simple hand-drawn sketch up the ladder. He argued, cajoled, and pleaded, battling the institutional inertia and the snobbery of senior officers who saw it as a frivolous distraction. It was his own private war, fought not with guns, but with memos and meetings, until finally he got the proposal in front of the one group that might actually listen. the Directorate of Tank Design. The idea from a hospital bed had found its champion. The unsolvable equation might just have a solution after all. Thanks to Major Norman's persistence, Peter Garlick's sketches were rescued from the bureaucratic wastebasket. By August 1943, the idea had transformed into a physical prototype. At the secretive fighting vehicles proving establishment in Chobham, engineers unveiled a crude, cylindrical stainless steel vessel, roughly the size of a large thermos flask, with a powerful immersion heater wired into its base. The mission: to boil 1 pint of water using nothing but the tank's own 24-volt electrical system. The first test was a spectacular failure. The vessel, unable to handle the steam pressure, ruptured with a violent bang. It sprayed boiling water and superheated steam across the turret interior, badly scalding 2 of the test crew members. It was a disastrous start. The very device intended to prevent burns had just inflicted them. The old guard at the War Office, who had sneered at the idea, felt vindicated. Mollycoddling, they had called it. Now it seemed it was dangerous mollycoddling, but the engineers at Chobham, led by a brilliant captain named Ronald Hazelden, refused to give up. They understood the stakes. Every week they spent refining the design. Another dozen men were dying in Normandy for a cup of tea. The challenge was immense. This wasn't a domestic kettle. This device had to survive the brutal, bone-jarring chaos of combat. It had to withstand violent vibrations and concussive shocks without leaking, breaking, or short-circuiting. A single electrical fault could disable the entire tank in the middle of a battle, and it had to operate flawlessly in every conceivable environment, from the frozen mud of a German winter to the scorching heat of a desert sun. For 9 grueling months, Hazelden's team worked relentlessly. They tested 43 different configurations, experimenting with new alloys, heating elements, and insulation methods. The breakthrough finally came in April 1944. The solution was a design of elegant, robust simplicity. They called it, with typical British understatement, the boiling vessel, or BV. At its heart was a double-walled container. The space between the walls was a vacuum, just like a modern thermos flask, but built to military-grade toughness. This vacuum layer was a stroke of genius. It kept the outer surface cool enough to touch, preventing crew burns, and it kept the water inside hot for nearly an hour after boiling, saving precious battery power. The heating element itself was a coil of nichrome wire, but it was sealed inside a protective copper sheath at the base. This prevented any direct contact between the electricity and the water, dramatically reducing the risk of a short circuit. To solve the problem of the exploding prototype, a simple pressure release valve was integrated into the screw-top lid, designed to vent safely if the steam pressure ever became too high. But the most crucial innovation was a small bimetallic thermostat. This simple device automatically cut the power the instant the water reached 98 degrees Celsius. This prevented the water from boiling dry and burning out the element, and it meant the crew didn't have to monitor it. Flip a switch, wait for the indicator light to turn from red to green, and you had a perfect quart of boiling water enough for 6 generous mugs of tea. The final design was a masterpiece of wartime engineering. It was compact, weighed just over 3 pounds, and could be mounted anywhere in the turret. It was ready. In June 1944, just days after the D-Day landings, the first operational BVs were rushed to the front lines in Normandy and retrofitted into the tanks of the invasion force. For the crews who received them, it was a revelation. It felt like a miracle. Inside their cramped steel sanctuary, surrounded by the chaos of the Normandy campaign, they could now perform that sacred ritual without ever setting foot outside. One flick of a switch, a 3.5-minute wait, and the loader could pass around steaming mugs of life-affirming tea, even as German shells fell around them. It was more than just a convenience. It was a profound psychological victory. It was a taste of home, a moment of civilization, delivered safely in the heart of the inferno. A Sherman commander with the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry wrote in his diary in July 1944, "We've brewed up 40 times this week. Tea, that is, not the other kind. Not once did we expose ourselves outside the tank. Jerry doesn't know when we're vulnerable anymore. Because we're never vulnerable." That last line was the key. The men at the top soon realized the BV wasn't just a morale booster. It was a revolutionary piece of tactical equipment. The Royal Armoured Corps began to meticulously track casualty data. They compared units that had been equipped with the BV against those who were still using the old, dangerous Primus stoves. The results were not just positive, they were staggering. In a controlled study over 6 weeks of brutal, continuous combat in Normandy, BV-equipped tank crews showed a 42% reduction in casualties suffered during rest periods. Even more telling, incidents of tanks being caught stationary and ambushed. The classic Bruhenziel scenario dropped by an incredible 67%. The 23rd Hussars Regiment, which had lost 9 tanks to ambushes during brewing stops between June and July, lost 0 tanks in the same situations during August and September after their BVs were installed. The commanding officer wrote in his report, "Not merely fewer, none at all. We still drink exactly as much tea. We simply don't die for it anymore." By October 1944, the evidence was overwhelming. A comprehensive analysis covering 17 regiments concluded that the BV had reduced casualties from exposed brewing activities by an astonishing 89%. Extrapolated across the entire British armoured force in northwest Europe, the statisticians calculated that this simple, frivolous kettle was preventing approximately 280 casualties every single month. It was saving nearly an entire tank company's worth of men from being killed or wounded, month after month. The device that senior officers had dismissed as mollycoddling just 18 months earlier was now being hailed as one of the most effective pieces of life-saving equipment of the war. Production was ramped up. The order went out from the War Office. The boiling vessel was to be installed in every single British armoured vehicle as standard equipment. The humble kettle had proven its worth in the most brutal currency of all: the lives of soldiers. It wasn't just making tea, it was making history. The initial objective of the boiling vessel was purely defensive, to keep men alive. But what British military planners and even its inventor never anticipated was how this simple device would become a powerful offensive weapon. It didn't just change survival rates, it fundamentally rewrote the doctrine of modern armoured warfare. It sparked a silent revolution from inside the turret. Before the BV, British armoured doctrine was shackled by a 3-hour rule, not for the tanks, which could run for days, but for the men inside them. Planners knew that after about 3 hours of continuous buttoned-up operations, crew effectiveness would plummet. Nerves would fray, fatigue would set in, and the desperate need for a brew-up would become an overriding tactical consideration. Entire battle plans had to incorporate mandatory tea breaks, pulling units off the line and creating predictable lulls in the fighting that the enemy could exploit. The BV shattered that shackle. Lieutenant James Holliman of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry captured the dawning realization in his diary in September 1944. Remained in ambush position for 11 hours yesterday. Made tea 4 times. Never broke concealment. Previously, an hour was our maximum before someone absolutely had to brew. This changes everything about how we can fight. He was right. Everything changed. The impact on operational tempo was immediate and profound. During the lightning advance through Belgium in September 1944, the British 11th Armoured Division covered 250 miles in just 6 days, a relentless pace that would have been physically and psychologically impossible under the old brewing constraints. Their official after-action report specifically credited the BV. Crews remained fresh and alert throughout rapid advances. The ability to brew whilst moving or during brief halts eliminated the need for extended rest stops. We maintained a pursuit momentum that previous generations of armoured forces could not have sustained. The tactical advantages spread into every aspect of combat. Night operations, once notoriously difficult, were transformed. The telltale flame and smell of a Primus stove had always been a beacon for German patrols. The BV, however, was silent, scentless, and invisible in the dark. British armoured units could now conduct extended night patrols and lay in wait for hours in perfect concealment, striking from the darkness with terrifying surprise. The 7th Armored Division reported a 43% increase in successful nighttime engagements after the full installation of BVs. Even fuel consumption was affected. Previously, crews would often leave their tank engines idling for hours during halts, either to run the heaters in winter or just to keep the batteries topped up. With the BV drawing only minimal power, crews could now shut down their engines completely, conserving precious fuel while still enjoying a hot drink. The 3rd Royal Tank Regiment calculated this practice alone reduced their overall fuel consumption by nearly 8%, significantly extending their operational range. Perhaps the most ingenious application was in the art of deception. British commanders, knowing the Germans were trained to look for the Bruhenziel, the brewer's target, began to use that expectation against them. They would deliberately position a single tank in a seemingly vulnerable spot, mimicking the posture of a crew preparing for tea. German anti-tank gunners, anticipating an easy kill on a distracted stationary target, would open fire, only to reveal their own positions. The bait tank, fully crewed and alert, would then immediately return fire, while other British tanks, hidden in ambush nearby, would spring the trap. The boiling vessel had gone from being the reason for the ambush to being the bait for the counter-ambush. The British Army entered peacetime with the BV firmly established as essential equipment. What they hadn't predicted was how quickly the rest of the world would stop laughing and start copying. The Canadians and Australians, who had fought alongside the British and witnessed the BV's effectiveness firsthand, were the first to adopt it. American resistance lasted the longest, rooted in the same rugged, Patton-esque culture that dismissed tea as a weakness. Throughout the Korean War, U.S. armored crews subsisted on instant coffee and cold sea rations, suffering disproportionately high rates of frostbite and dehydration-related fatigue compared to their British Commonwealth allies operating in the same brutal conditions. The data was undeniable. The only significant difference in their equipment was the British tank's ability to provide its crew with hot water. Finally, in 1954, the U.S. Army quietly began installing what they called crew comfort heating systems in their new M48 Patton tanks. They refused to call it a kettle, but the principle was identical. The mollycoddling had become American military policy. The most pragmatic adopters were the Soviets. After capturing several BV-equipped British tanks during post-war exercises, their engineers meticulously reverse-engineered the design. By the 1952, new Russian tanks began appearing with their own version. In a delicious Cold War irony, communist tank crews were now brewing up their own tea using a direct copy of a capitalist invention, all because the simple, human logic behind it was universal. The revolution was complete. A device born from a simple soldier's desire for a safe cup of tea had not only saved thousands of lives, but had also gifted the British Army a series of tactical advantages nobody had foreseen. It had rewritten military doctrine across the globe, proving that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a bigger gun or thicker armor, but a simple machine that remembers the soldier inside is still a man. The veterans who first used the boiling vessel are nearly all gone now. Their voices fade into history, like the rumble of their Sherman tanks across the fields of Europe, but their legacy lives on, simmering quietly inside every modern armored vehicle that rolls off a production line today. The story of the BV is the journey of an idea from the absurd to the essential. It began as a deadly ritual, an act of tactical madness that cost hundreds of lives. It became an unsolvable equation for high command, a conflict between military necessity and human nature. Then, from the pain and frustration of a single wounded soldier, it was reborn as a simple, brilliant invention. It evolved from a piece of comfort equipment into a revolutionary weapon that changed battlefield tactics, saved thousands from death or injury, and gave a weary army a crucial edge. And at the center of it all was Peter Garlick, the 8-year-old radio operator who simply asked, why? He never sought recognition for his invention. He never applied for a patent, which could have made him a wealthy man after the war. He never requested honors or medals. After his recovery, he quietly returned to his trade as an electrician. He saw a problem that was killing his comrades, and with a pencil and a piece of paper, he fixed it. He died in 1989, a quiet hero whose simple act of battlefield empathy likely saved more lives than many generals. His true monument isn't made of stone or bronze. It's the countless sons and daughters, grandsons and granddaughters, who exist today because their ancestors came home. Today, the principle of the boiling vessel is a global military standard. The British Army's latest Challenger 3 tank features an advanced, multi-purpose BV that can heat water and food rations simultaneously in under 60 seconds. And inside the turret of the formidable American M1 Abrams, the pride of the U.S. Armored Corps, is a similar system. The very idea that General Patton once mocked as a sign of British softness is now mission-essential equipment for American GIs. From the German Leopard 2 to the Israeli Merkava, the ability to provide a crew with hot water safely and efficiently is no longer considered a luxury. It's a fundamental requirement of armored warfare. The U.S. Army's own field manual on armored operations now explicitly states that crew sustainment systems, including water heating capability, directly contribute to operational effectiveness. The journey is complete. The heresy of 1943 has become the doctrine of the 21st century. In the end, this story isn't really about tea at all. It's about the profound recognition that soldiers are humans first, and fighting machines second. It's a testament to the fact that caring for a soldier's basic human needs for warmth, for comfort, for a moment of civilized peace in the middle of chaos isn't mollycoddling. It's an operational necessity. It is the invisible armor that protects a soldier's mind and spirit, the very things that no amount of steel can ever truly shield. It is the simple, powerful truth that sometimes the difference between life and death, between victory and defeat, isn't a better weapon or a faster tank. It's a proper, hot cup of tea. This story proves that the smallest comforts from home can become the most powerful tools for survival in a war zone. The British had their tea, a ritual that anchored their very soul. So, we want to ask you, our community, for an American soldier, what seemingly small comfort do you believe would be absolutely non-negotiable? What is the American equivalent of the British cup of tea? Is it a specific brand of coffee from back home, a worn-out photograph in a helmet liner, the ability to listen to a particular song? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one, and we'd love to hear what you think is the true psychological anchor for a GI. Thank you for watching.